May I speak in the name of the one who loves me, who sustains me, and who gives me life. Amen. The sense of relief for me, perhaps for you, is almost palpable. The new curate is preaching her first sermon on the parable of the Good Samaritan. We know that one, learned it as children. She'll know that one. Together, we can think about those who walk on by, about how important it is not to be so preoccupied with our religion that we fail to notice what's going on around us. We might even commend one another for the good that we do to others. But I wonder if that's a helpful place to start when we do have such a familiar parable. The Jewish New Testament scholar, Amy Jill Levine, points out that as this story began to unfold, those listening to Jesus, they were the 72 that we heard about last week, and perhaps a few others. This Jewish audience, too, might have been feeling quite comfortable as they tuned in to the gradual and gentle revealing of their familiar threefold heritage. A priest of the line of Aaron, a Levite from the family of Jacob, and a Samaritan. Hang on a minute. No. Israelite. It should be Israelite. Surely it's priest, Levite, and Israelite. Jews know their lineage. You simply are one of the three. But instead, we hear Jesus tell the story of a priest, a Levite, and a Samaritan. Now, at that time, a priest or a Levite failing to stop would have been utterly unremarkable to a Jewish audience. Shocking to our ears, perhaps, but then, with their very specific purity laws, it's no great surprise. The surprise comes when, as Amy Jill Levine goes on to suggest, we realise that the dissonance caused in the ears of those Jewish listeners is something like a Christian's jarred reaction to hearing their familiar threefold heritage revealed as the Father, the Son, and the Devil. There's some fidgeting, a few sharp intakes of breath, a bit uncomfortable, and my heart's racing. I wonder, does the storyteller now have our full attention? Can it really be that in this parable, Jesus demands our full attention in such a shocking way, simply to tell us that we should all be kind to anybody in need? I mean, even good Samaritans are kind, and Christians hardly have the monopoly on kindness. In this first century context, Samaritans are the enemy. They're not the marginalised, they are the enemy. And in the Gospel 2 weeks ago, we heard how the apostles wanted fire to rain down from heaven because Samaritans would not allow Jesus to rest among them. For a quiet life, Samaria, the place, and its people, it was to be avoided. Remember the Samaritan woman at the well? She was alone. And much less trouble in life was likely if you walked the longer route, travelling from Jerusalem to Galilee. And you can see this clearly in maps of the period. Geographically, Samaria is surrounded by Jewish lands. Samaritans were the enemy embedded deeply in the heart of Israel, deeply in the hearts of the Jewish people. And that's when we are hearing this story, the parable of an encounter with the one whom we have been trying to avoid. Perhaps we might also entitle it the parable of the person in the ditch, because that's where Jesus begins this story, with a person in the ditch, stripped and beaten, wounded and half dead. Not dead, half dead, half alive, in fact. The parable of the one who is half alive. Perhaps this is why our full attention is required, because it is a matter of life and death. Is it really an encounter with the enemy, an encounter with that which we have been trying to avoid, that brings the possibility of life? Sometimes we are our own worst enemies. And whilst the role of Good Samaritan may seem aspirational, perhaps first we need to allow that bit of ourselves that is lying in the ditch to be attended to. Maybe there's something deep within that needs to be brought out into the light. A situation or a someone or a behaviour that has power over us, which seems to prevent us from living. Perhaps we know that there's a need to confront a painful reality and to engage with the other, to engage with that which has become so deeply embedded within the hearts of who we are, we as individuals, we as communities, that we might now need others to notice it for us, especially if we're too busy trying to take the long route around in a desperate attempt to avoid dealing with it. Instead of keeping our heads down for the sake of a quiet life, muddling through and coping from day to day, how much more alive might we be, might our neighbours and our communities be, if we found the courage to encounter the enemy before we get to the point that we are half dead in the ditch. Choosing to make the enemy our neighbour by daring to challenge and to overturn the causes of idolatry, of strife, of jealousy and anger, quarrels, dissensions and factions. Imagine, just for a moment, if you will, the most deplorable person or situation your prejudice, your politics, or your experience might conjure up. What is your enemy? Whether it's global climate change or fractured political systems or our own personal enemies, responding to that image is a really hard task. It's exhausting and bruising. So too is speaking out for those without a voice, growing in self-awareness and paying constant attention to the way we respond and act towards one another. Perhaps the mercy begins when we show to ourselves the mercy that God has shown to us. When we begin to accept and love the works in progress that we all are. Thy kingdom come, one day at a time. So if this really is the parable of the encounter with the one whom we've been trying to avoid. Contrast the challenge and the picture that you have just imagined with an image of the spiritual wrestling that takes place in the Garden of Gethsemane. "Remove from me this cup," Jesus cries, only to be willing to drink from that very same cup. Because it is through this encounter with the enemy deep within that Jesus offers us all the possibility of life. For you, Lord, prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies, a table around which we will shortly gather. Here, Lord, you have my love and my full attention, for here is life, and life in all its fullness.